Coming up on AVANT Technology Insights with Ken Presti.
This is a real test of whether or not your products serve a real purpose. If they're not adding value, if they're not essential to what that company does, you might be seeing an uptick in cancellations.
How should a company, any company, build a financial strategy in a world partly dominated by COVID-19? While people's health is a paramount concern, all of us in the business community are also called upon to take a hard look at what is central to your business, the importance of your value proposition, and the costs of inaction, as well as the cost of action. This is the kind of thing that can bring a company together. Remember, everyone on the Titanic wanted the captain to succeed. We'll have more right after this. Welcome to AVANT Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Research Vice President of AVANT Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series from AVANT Research and Analytics, we help enterprise decision makers sort through the business case, the value, the challenges, and ultimately the bottom line of technology adoption. So listen to us at your desktop, take us in the car, tune in from the commuter train, or download us at the gate. You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, as well as at www.goavant.net/podcast. My guest today is a financial veteran who, over the last 4 years, built out the first in-house finance function at AVANT Communications. He's seen good economic cycles, he's seen bad economic cycles, and everything in between. A short while ago, I heard him talking about how companies can remain successful amid the current economic environment, so I pretty much threw a net over him and dragged him into this episode. I want to welcome AVANT Chief Financial Officer, Brendan Taylor. So, Brendan, welcome to the program. Glad to have you on board. It's been quite a busy time in terms of evaluating the finances and just the overall financial situation in this COVID-19 era. We're in this weird semi-phase 1, semi-phase 2 stage in the coronavirus epidemic. Where do you see the finance picture currently standing right now for tech companies in general?
Yeah, well, it certainly is an unprecedented time. And I think whenever companies go through any kind of sudden shift, whatever's causing it, everyone's drawn into a refocus on how diversified am I? How essential are my products and services? How flexible is my cost base? How patient or demanding is my debt or my equity structure? So all of those things become very much front and center. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that there's plenty of companies that are born and that prosper inside downturns or times of extreme. So if we're thinking about AVANT, I actually relish these kinds of opportunities. But obviously for many companies, they're going to be at different points in their life cycle. I mean, over the last, 10 years, we've seen just what Amazon is doing to the legacy retail bricks and mortar space. And an event like what we're going through in 2020 only accelerates the end of the life cycle for some of those organizations. So of course, Ken, everyone's slightly different. But when I think about the tech space, I mean, at its core, technology should be about solving problems. So in an environment where you've never seen so many problems to solve, that should be an incredible time for productivity. And certainly at AVANT, I think that's what we see.
So what are you seeing in looking beyond AVANT, but in terms of the companies that are able to succeed in this kind of environment and the companies that can't? What do you see as the common denominators of each? How do you know if you're in a good space or not?
Yeah, I think we see some interesting things for sure, Ken. One of the things you have going in your favor if you're a much larger, maturer company that's been around for some time is you may have the luxury to do something like contingency planning, which for a much smaller, younger company is going to be a very lofty aspiration. So you'll see some companies able to come out very quickly with a plan of action where they knew full well what they wanted to do. They were just looking for the right time to do it, and whatever's going on seems to present that. So a good example could be a company that knew it needed to restructure its internal costs and was looking for the right time or reason to do that.
How do you go about developing a contingency plan in kind of a vacuum? Because nobody knows what the next thing is that they're going to get hit with. Any thoughts on how a company can pull that kind of thing together? Who on the staff needs to be involved in that? What are some of the things that they need to look at in pursuing that kind of an initiative?
I think one of the things, again, that younger, earlier stage developing companies, and let's face it, a lot of the companies in the tech space are exactly that. One of the challenges we always have is those contingencies, those single points of failure that the people or the processes or the infrastructure that we're desperately reliant on. So for a lot of companies, when they're faced with any kind of adversity, they're immediately going to look to see, well, where are those single points of failure? How do I identify them? What do I do about them? To your point, what can you do as a contingency? A smile. I find myself thinking of a rather dark metaphor, but I imagine the life of any CIO. I think as a CFO, I find it fairly easy to relate to the metaphor of something like the Titanic. I see my role sometimes as to actually count the number of lifeboats and reconcile that against the ship's manifest. Meanwhile,
Hmm,
the people
that's an
I'm with,
interesting metaphor right there. Yeah.
meanwhile, many of the people I'm working with appear to be having a good time on the dance floor. And so when things are good, you can feel like you're an outsider trying to win the hearts of minds of those that you're doing your utmost to protect. Now, of course, one of the luxuries that can come from a situation like the one that we're in is suddenly everyone who was on the dance floor enjoying themselves is now an advocate and more than willing to help you figure out whether or not you have or haven't got enough lifeboats. Of course, if you're halfway between Liverpool and New York, you've got a problem. So there's a lot in that. Clearly, a constant and ongoing assessment of where you think you might be single-threaded is one part. Stating where there's clear and obvious threats is another, but trying to help others appreciate that now is the time to act. That I think is a challenge that's been around for a very long time.
Hmm. So, and I mean, it comes down to, there's a time when you know that it's time to act, and then you've got to figure out how to act and what is it that you're going to do. So in a situation like this, where people are getting laid off left and right, and we've got all the economic, issues, and the stock market is up 1 minute, down the next. What are some of the things that companies can do to differentiate themselves and stay afloat in this environment?
Yeah, great question. Let's think about a couple of the things, if I may, Ken. Just following on from that theme around how does the board come together, the leaders and the decision makers, how do we get a consensus on what the right thing to do is? And I think one of the ways that I've been trying to help Avant and help other companies throughout my career is it's very easy to tally up the costs that you can easily see. It's not so easy to necessarily quantify what the opportunity costs are if you don't do something. And that's one of the areas where I know I would try and get involved. Yeah, classic example. With a founder or with an owner, they can see what the cost of action might be, but helping them understand what the costs of inaction could be. How do you weigh those risks and those
Hmm.
probabilities? And the only way you can really do that is to get the right group of people together and try and blend those different perceptions and come up with a result.
Who would be in the right group? I mean, you've obviously got your finance people there. You're going to have your management people. I'm guessing the product folks in whatever form that might take. But I got to think this is one of those things where you're looking more towards who it is that you've accidentally omitted that really needs to be able to, contribute to that equation, and who are some of the people that are frequently left out, some of the roles, I mean, that are frequently left out that, that need to be in that discussion.
Yeah, I think one of the areas where I tend to see this a lot, and Ken, this is obviously partly because of my background, having spent a lot of time either in professional services or technology companies. One of the areas where I see a classic opportunity for exposure is around people, funnily enough. So if I think about the different disciplines, I might have someone who's very much focused on markets and revenue. I might have someone who's very much focused on products and technologies. I might have someone who's very much focused on liquidity and the balance sheet and all of that fun stuff. I might have a CEO who's a champion for culture or for managing expectations with the board. One of the potential blind spots in all of that, I think, is how do you make sure that the people that you're inherently reliant on feel like they're secure, feel like they're motivated, feel like they're engaged. And this has been one of the fascinating things for me, Ken, going through what we're going through with this particular event, is the speed with which the organization has had to pivot to virtual working and what that means for a number of people who are tasked with motivating and maintaining an engaged workforce through a medium that they've maybe not ever been exposed to, certainly not from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, day in, day out.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that this paradigm, I think, creates as well, it's worth bearing in mind, is if we've got large groups of large organizations, private equity firms, companies that are suddenly shifting their focus to making sure that their bottom line results are where they need to be, suddenly there's a shift away from growth for growth's sake towards efficiency and effectiveness. And what that can mean for a lot of organizations is the opportunity to upgrade or recycle the talent that's in their stack. So if I'm a CIO somewhere and I'm busily scrambling trying to help figure out where my single points of failure are, don't overlook your team and making sure that the people that you inherently rely on are feeling motivated and engaged. Because what happens or tends to happen in my experience in these environments is one of the things that goes up in a downturn is the demand on that talent. I'm going to speak close to home. I've seen more interest in my inbox through LinkedIn from private equity in the last 4 months than I'd seen in the prior 2 years. There seems to be a hunt on for people that maybe know how to handle turnarounds or extreme situations. So suddenly you've got this situation where the people that are tried and true and the ones that you need to keep engaged and motivated and feeling good, you've got to not forget them while you're trying to figure out all of your plans. So again, for me personally, what that's also meant is a reminder these last few months. I've been thriving on involving myself in person with my teams. I'm someone who likes to operate in confined spaces with tight groups of well-meaning teams. I thrive on that energy. Being forced into isolation and having my team forced into isolation has definitely created some challenges for me in terms of how do I help make sure that they're motivated and engaged. And the thing that's really come back to me is remembering what is it, I think, that for most of us motivates us, which I think is a sense of I am making meaningful progress with work that I find meaningful. And so I've been able to keep that sense of engagement going throughout my working day when I'm in the office. I've had to find new ways to do that in a scenario where we're all now separated. And I think that's one of the big challenges for me. So again, going back to the top, all of these organizations, all of us trying to figure out where our single points of failure are, who needs to be in the room. That's one area where I think it's easy to make a mistake, perhaps, could be to overlook just how reliant we are on those core people. Who are they? How do we make sure they're engaged?
And that's something that every company, I think, has been grappling with. And there's been a lot of different ways to do that. One of the things that we've done at Avant is that a group of us have been getting together a couple of times a week. We're all on the same team. And we have basically a coffee morning where we spend 15 minutes talking about theoretically anything except business. And this is supposed to kind of keep that human interaction going by other means. So we talk about what we did on the weekend or basically anything. And this is seen as a replacement for kind of those incidental hallway conversations to keep the team more connected than they otherwise would be if we were just doing regular Zoom calls. But an interesting thing happened to me this week. I had to go to the office downtown for something, and I walked in, and I hadn't been there since the end of February, and I felt like I was walking into this ghost town. There was one other person in the building with me, and that was it. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, man, this has got to be an expensive asset considering the circumstances. I mean, this is always one of the main, that office space is always one of the things that are, that factor heavily on that balance sheet, no doubt. How do you think this situation is going to change that approach over the long haul? Not just in terms of office space per se, but in terms of how are we going to have to rethink our approach to assets?
Yeah, great question. Again, any organization that's suddenly faced with an extreme shift or uncertainty around what's going on, there's going to be that quick call to action to figure out what is my cost base comprised of, what's essential, what's not essential. And when I was leaving school, number one was always payroll. Number two was physical assets such as office space. We've seen office space increasingly shifting to third place with a big basket of things called SaaS subscriptions moving into second place, where a few moons ago, all of that software and IT hardware stuff was a capex expense, and suddenly that's become much more of a significant operating expense. And I think for a lot of organizations, that's one area that can be a tough one to quickly reconcile. I know I signed up for all of these licenses, but how many of them am I using, and why do I really need them? So those kinds of calls to action are going to be a really interesting one for a lot of companies when they try to figure that out. And I think, again, for Avant, one of the things we've been fortunate to see, and I think that's true for all of these IT firms, is this is a real test of whether or not your products serve a real purpose. If they're not adding value, if they're not essential to what that company does, you might be seeing an uptick in cancellations. So make sure your products and your services are relevant. Make sure they are solving a real problem. A much greater chance of being resilient throughout. And I think we see that a lot with the services that we provide. They are seen as utility. They are seen as necessary. They are seen as essential.
So in a way, we're kind of coming back to our roots in all of this because it comes down to the general value proposition, what it is that you do for the customer, how much of a value can you deliver, and from that, it becomes a somewhat Darwinian survival of the fittest thing.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, that's kind of what I love about Avant and what I love about its founders and what I love about the DNA of the people that I've joined to work with here, which is, if we look back at any chart about prosperity over time since the 1800s, it's up and to the right. Now, admittedly, if you were here in the 1930s, you'd question whether or not that was a great time, depending on which segment you're in. Clearly, there were people that were doing very well. But there was a majority that were not. But nevertheless, if we look at the overall, at the macroeconomic level, it's been up and to the right. That journey's been that journey for a good couple of 100 years consistently. And the thing that I think gives me confidence that that will continue is that if we imagine the simplest of Venn diagrams, the intersection between supply and demand is where prosperity occurs. And that's in the DNA of what we do. We figure out how to help supply and demand get together in ways that are beneficial. That's what and we won't cease to do that. The supply might change, the demand might change. But trying to ensure that the intersection is as big as it can be and as relevant as it can be, that's AVANT's DNA as far as I'm concerned. That's what we are. And I think that that's a healthy business model for anybody. Yeah, I'm reading stories online of lobster farmers in Maine that, they've got plenty of lobsters and no customers. That's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. If you're all about the one thing and your market's moved, that's hard. But if what you're ultimately about is making sure that you've matched the best supply with the best demand, why on earth should you fear a downturn? All that's happening is a shift. But the paradigm's still real. Does that make sense, Ken?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. As a matter of fact, so I would cap this off by saying that this forces us all to raise our game. It forces us to get back to our roots. It forces us to look at what is, really significant and what is not. It forces us to look at our assets. It forces us to look at how people are deployed and what their skill sets are and whether or not we're, leveraging them to the fullest ability. It's a scary time in our period in history, I would say. But at the same time, there's always a lot of opportunity in these scary times. So great feedback, my friend. Great perspectives today. Brendan Taylor, the Chief Financial Officer of AVANT Communications. Thank you very much for being here today. Great interview, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Ken.
You've been listening to AVANT Technology Insights, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. AVANT Technology Insights is a service of AVANT Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host. For more information, please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goavant, as in victory, ant.net. For AVANT Research and Analytics, this is Ken Presti.